Hey guys, this is Denny.
This is James from TeaDB, and today we have episode number 67. As you might be able to tell, it's kind of a special episode.
Yeah, so James has bought and grabbed two different raw pu'erhs that have been aged in different places within China. One in a far more humid place and one in a far less humid place. So we're going to compare the two and talk about the differences between aging processes for pu'erh. And just see what the differences are. So
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. So what do we have here, James? These are both of these are from 2000.
Yep, so both of these are from 2000. So this tea that Denny's holding up right there, that is from White2Tea's, and that was stored in a more humid environment in Guangdong in southern China. Mm-hmm. And the 7561 was stored where a lot of pu'erh is stored in Kunming, which is usually thought of as pretty on the dry end of storage. Mm-hmm. So we would expect to have a much less aged tea for that. And this episode isn't necessarily to say, oh, one type of storage is way better than the other, mm-hmm. rather than they're different, and they have different positives and different negatives to them.
Mm-hmm. And when James says wet versus dry storage, primarily what we're talking about is humidity. So the ambient amount of water, moisture in the air. And as many of you know, southern China is extremely humid, whereas in Kunming it can be much drier. I wouldn't know that from first-hand experience, but the weather people tell me these things. So, some tiny little gaiwans here. What do we got here? 60 mils?
We have 60 milliliter gaiwans and 4 grams of each tea.
Cool.
And so we're going to start off with the Yunnan sourcing tea, which is the CNNP 7561. Okay. And we have a couple different teas here, but the important thing isn't really the teas themselves in this episode, it's more storage. Right. So this is kind of like everything else where, you should try some wet stored teas, you should try some dry stored teas, and you should see what you like. Yeah. I think you'll find that a lot of vendors will say, hey, this method is way better. And then you look at what tea they sell, and of course they sell that type of tea. Right. And then you'll have other vendors that say completely the opposite. So, right. And some people will say that the wetter stored teas are worse for your health, and a lot of that is just simply marketing.
Very interesting. Now, there is going to be a acceleration of the fermentation process from a more wet stored tea. So it could be the case that some of the flavors might balance out a little bit better. It could be the case that some of the heavier notes smooth out a little bit, but that's not necessarily the case. And the point of doing this is more about comparing the two and trying to understand sort of the signature that is wet versus dry stored. Again, we're not trying to make judgments between the two per se, just understand the differences.
Yep. And of course you're going to get different versions of wet and dry storage depending on where you go. Like totally. Kunming dry storage is not the same as Hong Kong dry storage.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Cheers.
Cheers. So despite being 14 years old, this tea still shows a lot of youth. You can even see just from the color that it's still brewing up kind of like this yellow and a little bit of orange in there. And that's very, very indicative of the storage conditions of the tea.
Mm-hmm. Much more familiar for me as a absolute plebeian when it comes to, wrong word choice there, but when it comes to drinking raw pu'erh, I tend to drink younger raw pu'erh. And I don't drink it that much, but yeah, this has much more of your kind of traditional flavor profile, smoky, earthy. It has a good amount of age on it, so I think it's smooth. Yeah. It's balanced out.
Some of that pine, yeah. It is relatively smooth, like for a young raw pu'erh, but it definitely does taste not extremely aged.
Mm-hmm. It's frankly quite nice. Very smooth. Yeah, and the decor is very yellow. The leaves are very white still, in comparison with the White2T, which is far more orange. So it'll be interesting to see the elixirs and how they change. Yeah, this traditional smoky, quite nice.
Yeah, and as you can see, one of the other characteristics between dry and wetter storage is the wetter stored teas, kind of like ripe pu'erh, will just come apart a little bit easier.
Mm-hmm.
So that means that this will take maybe a little bit longer. I did my best to kind of break it up a little bit so we could get more flavor early on.
Good point.
But it will affect how the tea ends up brewing.
Definitely, and I think perhaps more having a larger effect too is going to be the compression, the amount of actual compression that they do with the tea as well.
Definitely.
Yeah, and again, we're just talking about the little critters that are going to get in there and do their magic and affect the actual taste and chemical compounds within the tea. Those are the actual bacteria and yeasts that are part of the fermentation process for pu'erh, which is one reason why we all like it so much.
Yep.
So, yeah. But, okay, so this is the second steeping here. Color saturation is much thicker. This is a fairly thin viscosity, interestingly enough.
Yeah, it
I
is.
think that'll increase a little bit here. Really nice. I think this captures all of the good flavor notes of raw without any of the kind of potentially brute force aspects of a young raw pu'erh.
Yep.
So this is, to me, just tastes like really a nice, smooth, classic raw pu'erh.
Yeah, no, I think so too. Definitely doesn't have as much of that aggression as you would get in something younger. Of course, it has been aged 14 years, so that has quite a bit to do with that. But
yeah, this is good. This is solid. I wonder if I'd be curious to find out, tasting these two side by side, which one of these teas is going to be more approachable. Because they're the same age, they're the same production, but it could end up being the case that just by virtue of the storage alone, we're going to have a very different flavor profile. So I'm excited to get comparison.
And storage becomes increasingly important just as the age of the tea gets older. And part of this episode is just to indicate that you can't just look at a tea and be like, oh, it's from 2000, it should be X age. The storage is perhaps even more so important because you could store a tea in Hong Kong for like 5 years and maybe it would be much more mature than this tea is already. Yeah. Because this tea, it's 14 years old, but it probably still has some more aging to do,
Absolutely.
to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is very different than a ripe pu'erh where you're artificially, kind of you're sort of fabricating the fermentation process in a factory and accelerating the process dramatically. So a ripe pu'erh is going to develop far more quickly and then be, for the most part, done. And then age is sort of just a kind of a label at that point. But with these teas, like James just said, age is going to have a big impact, and as we're finding out, the storage is as well. So this is quite nice.
And I read a really interesting book that you just kind of reminded me of that kind of covered this as sort of an analogy, because ripe pu'erh, of course, is called cooked pu'erh as well. And so you could think of that fermentation process, like you were saying, in the factory, as the cooking process of the tea. So the equivalent in raw pu'erh would be slow cooking, extreme slow cooking. And if you were to store it in a more humid environment, it would be a quicker version of cooking in some sense. Right,
pressure cooking or something.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a good metaphor. I like that. And again, it could be, to use the same metaphor, it could be the same cut of meat or, the same dish you're preparing, but the way in which you're, you're storing it, the humidity, the pressure, and the compression, they're all going to have an impact on the flavor and taste. And this isn't the same roughage. It's not the actual same leaf material either, correct?
No, it's not.
So this is some sort of blend, of, from, I'm sure, a bunch of different factories and farms all over.
Yeah, it's very much unclear what the original base material was for both of these teas, and at this point it's pretty much impossible for us to say.
So, I'm going to give this another couple sips, but what do we have next? What are we gonna?
Yeah.
How much do we have next, and what are we gonna do?
So we're gonna be doing the White2T too.
Okay.
So that's the 2000 TeaDB 7532.
Okay.
And the important thing, as is the case for this tea, is not necessarily the tea itself, but the storage method.
Awesome. And are we gonna use the same amount of tea leaf and so forth?
Yep, that's correct.
Cool. All right. Well, I'm gonna enjoy this, and we'll get back there in a second.
Yep.
Cheers. Let's do it.
Yep.
Fresh Gaiwan, another 60 milliliters, and we're going to do 4 grams of tea. Is that, generally speaking, kind of the proportions that you like to use?
Yeah, relatively speaking for raw pu'erh. And you know, older pu'erh, the more aged it gets, it'll brew up a little bit differently, and the leaves will start to come apart a little bit more. Mm-hmm. So, you know, there are small variations to it, but I would say that's about right for most of it.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to it. And just from already the saturation, the color of the actual base material itself is far more red and orange, as opposed to kind of the whiter, greener one that we had from north. And yeah, I mean the core is already far more orange. I'm excited. This is going to be very different.
Yeah.
Very cool.
It will be.
So James, do you do these kind of comparisons at home often?
I do, if I have the time and the space. It's interesting to compare these teas, and I think you'll find out a lot about your personal preference pretty quickly, just doing 1 or 2 side-by-side comparisons.
Really nice aroma, beautiful liqueur, and James is just doing really quick little flash brews here. Hot Gaiwan.
Yep, hot Gaiwan.
And the actual color itself is just so much more orange and red, so much more similar to a ripe pu'erh. And you know, I wonder if you had in kind of like a infinite amount of time, if all pu'erh would sort of end up this color or not.
As it matures.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do wonder.
I think all properly aged pu'erh will kind of move towards this this kind of like very dark and then eventually red, because this is still probably not fully mature yet. Yeah.
All right, well, let's give it a go.
Cheers.
Cheers, guys. Ooh. So, just from the aroma, far more woody, not nearly as smoky.
Mm-hmm. Just
level of sweetness.
Yep, and it's just much more mature.
Yeah.
It's like kind of like Denny was saying. If we look at ripe pu'erh as fully mature pu'erh, because I mean, a lot of us haven't tasted a whole lot of aged pu'erh, which will also have a lot of that maturity. And this is just much closer to that.
Definitely, absolutely. I get more of that sort of mineral-y, je ne sais quoi aged experience that I never can describe but always talk about, and much more akin to a ripe pu'erh. So I would say that this, just off of a first impression, wow, look at that color.
Yeah, you'd see it's now just totally red.
Yeah, so off of a first impression, I think this probably would be a little more approachable.
I agree.
For a new tea drinker.
For us, at least.
Yeah.
It's much more smoother than, for example, a younger raw pu'erh. And that's not to say that this isn't smooth, but it's just a lot less aged than this tea is.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, when James is saying more or less aged, in some sense we're almost talking about quote-unquote biological age, really the quickness at which the actual microbes are affecting the tea and doing all that stuff. And this is just happening a lot faster because of the climate. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the storage conditions, the humidity, the heat, all that stuff.
Really lovely, really smooth. The first steeping was very much a light steeping. You can tell, and just because of the color alone, I'm anticipating a much fuller body on this one.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of develop like ripe pu'erh, start a little bit light and kind of develop.
But not super viscous. I think the ratio right here is perfect for 60 mils to 4 grams. I think it's really solid.
Oh, that's really good. Yeah, just sweet, kind of vanilla. Some of those, I don't know. For me, these types of teas are like super easy for me to drink.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, lovely front end of sweetness, hinting a little bit of fruit, but nothing overwhelming. That wonderful woody, mineral-y taste that I love with ripe.
Yeah.
You know, if I were just tasting this by itself, I would probably assume this is a ripe pu'erh. Frankly.
Makes sense.
And just looking at it in the gaiwan and everything, it has a lot more classical signs of a ripe pu'erh.
Yep.
And again, we're just talking about sort of the maturity of the tea through the processing, and nothing more really. So it doesn't mean that you can't find delicious, raw, dry aged pu'erh. Does not mean that at all.
No. And in fact,
just different.
I would argue that the taste of this is much deeper and easier to drink right now. But if we were to talk about the future aging potential of both of these teas, I think the dry stored tea would definitely have a lot more room to grow in the future. And kind of that, to go back to that slow cooking, fast cooking analogy, it just allows it much more time to develop additional complexities over the years.
Absolutely. And that could be one thing you guys look out for and ask vendors about. If you are buying higher ticket priced Pu'erh teas, go ahead and ask the folks that you're buying from about the storage process if they know or not, and make sure to see photos and stuff. You know, if you're spending a fair amount of money on some kind of high-end boutique teas, you should have the ability to ask some kind of interesting questions and get some good answers. So
for sure,
yeah, if someone is selling you Pu'erh tea, they should know about these things.
Yeah, storage is super important, and it's one thing to be selling like 2-year-old raw pu'erh or just completely new raw pu'erh to people. It's another thing to be selling a 14-year-old tea and have no idea about the storage. In fact, that would call into question a lot of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder, what's the humidity like here in Seattle? I wonder if how we're storing these teas here is affecting things. I know, James, that you actually have a Pu'erh closet and you leave a little bit of water out.
I do, yeah. I have a little Pu'erh fridge over there that's a nice enclosed little microclimate. A lot of people call them Pu'midors. And the idea is basically that you're able to control it a little bit easier. And I just do real simple stuff like add a bowl of water. And I found that the humidity of Seattle is surprisingly high.
Yeah.
But we definitely have our dry spells, and the humidity will then drop, and so that's usually when I end up adding that bowl of water. Yeah, it'll be really interesting, and really time is the only test, because Pu'erh has not been stored in a lot of places of the world until much more recently.
Right.
And that includes most places in China.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's still kind of a new craze, and the funniest thing about a new craze that uses a lot of old age stuff is that it can be expensive and very misunderstood. So,
yep.
It's been fun to learn about Pu'erh on the show and drink some really, really yummy stuff. So, James, if people wanted to try out these different teas, maybe do a comparison, and maybe learn a little bit more about tea, what would you suggest they do?
Yeah, so you should come, you should also come visit TeaDB, but this tea, the 7561 2000 CNNP, comes from Yunnan sourcing, and kind of like we were talking about, it still has a lot of the youth, definitely dry stored, so there's probably future potential to age if you want to buy a 14-year-old tea to age. And then this other tea you can acquire from White2Tea's. And so I believe this was about $75 for a 250-gram brick, so you could probably buy a sample for a tenth of that or less. And this tea was a little bit more expensive. It's, I think, $145 for a 357-gram Bing, so you could probably get a sample for $15.
Okay.
So the 7532 from White2Tea's is a little bit more expensive. But I'd recommend both teas.
Yeah, absolutely, me too. This is going to be something that's going to be ready to drink now. They're both ready to drink now, but like James said, this is going to age probably a lot. The aging on this will affect it more. Let's put it that way.
Yes.
And, if you're looking for something closer to a ripe, go for the White2T. If you want something that's kind of a nice balanced raw,
Yeah.
I would recommend this Yunnan sourcing.
Or pick up both and do a tasting comparison.
Do it.
Figure out what you like.
Yeah, and just to reiterate one more time, check us out on TeaDB.org, subscribe. We're doing these videos all the time. If you guys have comments about other comparisons that you'd be interested in learning about, please shoot us a line. We're also going to be at the Northwest Tea Festival doing a tasting in October.
Yep, early October.
And so I think we're still undecided about what we'll do. So if you guys have some comments, let us know as well. I'd love to interact with you folks.
Yeah, cheers. Thanks for watching, guys.
Cheers, guys.